I'm Cassandra Rourke, 46, and I spent 28 years being underestimated by nearly every room I walked into. From a recruiting desk that saw an admin clerk to a career quietly enabling the missions no one ever hears about. For years, I let people call my work support and let the label sit, because I knew what my hands had done in the dark when it counted. But when a young Green Beret captain looked at my uniform the night before, I took command of his group and sent me to the coat check, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who never bothered to look twice at everything you carry? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The ballroom was still half empty when I walked in, and that was exactly how I liked it. There is a version of every room that only exists in the 20 minutes before it fills, when the catering staff are still folding the last napkins and the light hasn't been swallowed by bodies yet, and you can stand at the edge and read the whole thing like a map. I had learned a long time ago that the people who arrive early see everything, and the people who arrive late only see the crowd. So I came early. I always came early. I found a spot near the tall windows, took a glass of sparkling water that I had no intention of finishing, and let myself become part of the wallpaper. My service uniform was pressed and correct. My hair was in the same tight bun it had been in for most of my adult life. And the small cluster of devices on my chest meant nothing to almost everyone who would walk past me that night. That was fine. It usually did. For 28 years, I had been the last person in any room that anyone expected to be in charge. And somewhere around my mid-20s, I had stopped correcting them. Stopped being a wound and started being a tool. When people decide you are furniture, they say things in front of you they would never say to a person they were watching. They relax. They reveal themselves. And by the time they realize what you actually are, the conversation is already over, and you already have your answer. The room I was reading tonight belonged to the special operations community. The tight, loud, self-certain world I had spent my whole career inside, without ever quite being counted as one of its own. Chests full of ribbons, tabs on shoulders, men who could bench a small car and quote a mission from 12 years ago, line for line. I loved them, most of them, the way you love a difficult family. I also knew exactly how they saw me, and it had almost never been correctly. I thought about the recruiting station where all of this started, back in 1998. I was 18, standing in front of a sergeant with a coffee ring on his desk and a bored look on his face. And he took one glance at me and said I'd make a fine admin clerk. Not a question, not an insult even in his mind, just a fact he was doing me the favor of stating. I remember nodding, because I didn't have anything better to say, and then I remember thinking, very quietly, that I would decide what I was going to be, and he would find out about it the same way everyone else did. Late. It took years. It took deployments most people never hear about, the kind where you don't lead the raid but you make the raid possible, where you sit in a plywood room with a headset and a map and you are the reason 12 men come home instead of 8. Nobody pins a medal on you for being the steady voice. Nobody writes the movie about the person who kept the picture straight while the shooting happened somewhere out in the dark. But the men who were out in that dark, some of them they knew, and one of them, years ago, changed how I carried all of it. His name was Duke Ellison, and by the time I met him, he was a command sergeant major with more war behind him than most units see in a generation. I was a young enlisted soldier then, and I did what I always did, which was outwork everyone in the room and say almost nothing about it. Duke watched me for about a week without a word. Then one night, over bad coffee in a worse tent, he told me the thing I have carried ever since. "Let them think you carry the coffee, Rourke," he said. "The ones who matter will see your hands are steady when it counts." He died in 2019. I still hear him more often than I hear most living people. He is the reason I never flinch when a room decides I'm nobody. He taught me that being underestimated is a gift a smart person unwraps slowly. My phone buzzed against my hip. It was Naomi, my operations officer, telling me she was running 15 minutes behind because of traffic off the interstate, and did I want her to hurry. Naomi Frost was 38, sharp as a boot knife, and constitutionally unable to let anyone disrespect me without wanting to do something about it. I typed back that she should take her time, that I was fine, that I wanted a few minutes to feel out the room before the speeches started. She sent back a single word, which was, of course, behave. She knows me too well. The truth was that I preferred to walk into the lion's den by myself. An entourage tells a room what to think before it has a chance to be honest with you. Alone, in the corner, with a glass I wasn't drinking, I got the honest version. And the honest version of this particular room, the night before I would take command of everything in it, was that not one person here had placed me yet. To them, I was a middle-aged colonel standing by the window. Probably staff, probably protocol, probably someone's +1 who wandered off. I watched a young officer's eyes pass over me and move on without a flicker, the way you look past a lamp. I smiled, a little, to myself. Tomorrow this whole room would stand in formation, and I would take the colors of the group, and the picture they had of me would be corrected all at once, in the loud, formal, public way the Army does everything. But tonight I got to stand here and watch them be themselves. Tonight I got the honest version. And I have always believed that the honest version of people, the one they show when they think no one who matters is looking, tells you almost everything you will ever need to know about how they'll lead, how they'll follow, and who they'll become when the pressure is real. I settled in against the window, steady hands around a glass, a woman nobody had figured out yet, and I let the room fill up around me. They came in 2s and 3s, then in a flood. The noise rose, the light got warmer and thicker, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a laugh started carrying across the room that would, before the night was over, belong to a young man who was about to learn the oldest lesson I know. The reception filled the way these things always do, from the bar outward. Within half an hour, the ballroom had gone from a quiet map to a crowded, humming machine. And I moved through it, the way I moved through most crowds, slowly, along the edges, greeting the handful of people who actually knew who I was, and letting the rest sort me however they liked. The sorting started almost immediately, and it was familiar enough to be comforting. A silver-haired man I didn't recognize handed me his empty glass without breaking his conversation, assuming I was waitstaff. I set it on a passing tray and said nothing. A colonel's wife, kind and a little frantic, caught my elbow and asked if I knew when the shrimp was coming out, because she had been told to ask the event people. I told her I'd find out, found a caterer, and pointed the answer back her way. She thanked me warmly and called me dear. None of it stung. You cannot be insulted by a mistake you predicted 20 years ago. I have thought a lot over the years about why it happens so reliably. It isn't only that I'm a woman, though that's most of it in a room like this. It's that I don't perform rank. I don't fill the doorway. I don't tell the war story with my hands. I learned early, from Duke and from a few others, that the people who are genuinely dangerous in our line of work are almost never the ones who look it. So I stopped trying to look it. And the cost of that choice is that on nights like this, I get handed a lot of empty glasses. I was refilling my water when I first really noticed him. He was easy to notice. He was the center of a small, tight knot of junior officers near the bar. A captain, Green Beret, maybe 31 or 32, built like he did it for a living, which he did. He had the walk, the tab on his shoulder, the deep tan of a man just back from somewhere hot, the easy certainty of someone who's been told he's exceptional since he was old enough to catch a ball. He was telling a story, and he was telling it well, his hands cutting the air, his voice pitched just loud enough to pull in the officers on the edges of his circle. They laughed on cue. He was magnetic. I'll give him that. I have known a lot of magnetic men, and I have buried a few of them, and I have learned to watch the magnetic ones the way you watch weather, not with judgment, just reading it. Someone near me murmured his name, Vaughn, and that he'd done well on his last rotation, and that he was one to watch. I filed it away. One to watch. They always are, the loud ones. The question is never whether they're talented. The question is what they do with the people who can't do anything for them. I got my answer to that question about 10 minutes later, and I didn't even have to go looking for it. Off to the side of the room, near the tables where the support detail was running the event, a young sergeant was trying to do her job. She was small and squared away and clearly running on very little sleep, the kind of soldier who gets handed the thankless tasks because she never complains about them. Her name tape read, Blaine, and an officer, not Vaughn, a major who had found the open bar early, was leaning over her table and talking over her, loud and dismissive, telling her she'd set something up wrong and making sure the people nearby heard him do it. I watched Sergeant Blaine take it. I watched her jaw tighten and her eyes stay down and her hands keep working, and I recognized her instantly, because she was me 25 years ago, at a desk with a coffee ring on it. I walked over. I didn't make a scene. I just stepped into the space beside the major, close enough that he had to acknowledge me, and I asked him pleasantly whether he needed help with something, because the sergeant looked to me like she had it handled. He blinked, registered the eagle on my uniform without quite registering what it meant, decided I outranked him enough to not be worth the fight, and drifted back toward the bar with his drink. Sergeant Blaine looked up at me, wary, waiting to find out what this new person wanted from her. "You've got it under control," I told her. "Ignore the noise. Keep working." She nodded, still not sure what to make of me. That was all right. I wasn't doing it to be thanked. I was doing it because Duke did it for me once, and because somebody has to keep the chain going or it breaks. Naomi found me a few minutes later, having finally beaten the traffic, and she took one look at my face and then followed my eyes across the room to Vaughn's little court by the bar. "Oh, I know that look," she said quietly, taking a glass for herself. "You found the one." "I haven't found anything," I said. "I'm just watching the weather." "He's going to learn tomorrow the hard way," Naomi said, in front of the whole formation. "Maybe," I said. "Tomorrow can wait. Tonight he gets to be himself." And across the room, Captain Vaughn threw his head back and laughed at his own story, loud enough to turn heads, completely unaware that the middle-aged woman by the water pitcher was going to be reading his personnel file by lunch the next day. I sipped my water. I let him be himself a little while longer. It is remarkable what people will show you if you only let them. I didn't seek him out. I want to be clear about that because of how the rest of the night went. I didn't cross the room to teach anyone a lesson. I have never once in my life gone looking to be disrespected, and I have never had to. It finds you on its own schedule if you stand still long enough and let people be honest. What happened was that the crowd shifted, the way crowds do, and I ended up near the bar refilling my glass, and Vaughn's circle had spread out into the space, and suddenly I was standing at the edge of it. He was between stories. His eyes did the thing I have watched 1,000 pairs of eyes do. They landed on me, took a quick inventory, the age, the bun, the calm, the branch insignia he misread in half a second, and filed me under, harmless, rear echelon, staff, safe. I could have moved. I have moved 100 times, drifted away before the comment came, because I usually can feel it coming, and I usually don't have the patience for the theater of it. But I was tired that night, tired in the good way, the night before a command way, and some stubborn part of me decided I was going to stand exactly where I was and drink my water and let the young man do whatever he was going to do. He looked at me, he looked at my uniform, and he smirked, the way you smirk when you've got an audience and you've just thought of something you find funny. "Support section's over by the coat check, ma'am," he said. The knot of officers around him chuckled. Right on cue. A couple of them had the grace to look a little uncomfortable, but most of them laughed because he was the sun and they were pointed at him. And when the sun makes a joke, you laugh. He wasn't finished. They never are when the audience gives them the first laugh. He gestured with his drink loosely toward the far end of the room, and he told me in the warm, confident, condescending voice of a man explaining the world to someone he's decided is beneath him, that the real work in this community happened downrange, in the dark, at the tip of the spear, and that he was sure my support role was very important too. In its way, keeping the paperwork straight so the operators could operate. He said the word, support, the way some people say a word they think is a synonym for small. I want to tell you that I felt a great flare of anger. I didn't. I have felt that flare when I was younger, and I have learned what it costs and what it's worth, which is nothing. What I felt instead was something closer to recognition and something almost like tiredness, and underneath both of those, very steady, the thing Duke put in me a quarter-century ago. Steady hands. Let them think you carry the coffee. I set my glass down on the bar. I didn't set it down hard. I just set it down, and the small sound of it was somehow louder than his voice, and the circle noticed. "I'll keep that in mind, Captain," I said. That was all. 2 seconds, no heat in it, and I watched him get ready to enjoy having won the exchange. But something had already started to go wrong in his face, and I knew what it was before he did, because I had felt his eyes drop from mine down to my chest, to the small cluster of devices there, to the one particular pin that means almost nothing to almost everyone in the world and means absolutely everything to the few hundred people alive who can read it. The distinctive crest of the group, the device beside it that you do not get for keeping paperwork straight, the quiet, unshowy insignia of a person who has been where he thinks only he has been, and further. I saw the exact instant it landed. The smirk didn't fade so much as fall off. His jaw stopped. His shoulders, which had been loose and easy and owning the room, pulled back and up without his permission into something involuntary, something the body does before the mind catches up, something close to attention. The tan couldn't hide it. The color ran straight out of his face. "That's," he said, and stopped. "You're?" He couldn't finish either sentence. I have never in my life seen a man's certainty leave his body faster. And then a calm, gravelly voice spoke from just behind my right shoulder, unhurried, warm, and absolutely certain. The voice of Command Sergeant Major Otis Brandt, who had been part of this group longer than some of these officers had been alive, and who had come to find me, because that was his job. "Evening, Colonel Rourke," Brandt said. He nodded to me, easy as anything, and then he looked at the circle of young officers, and the temperature of the whole exchange changed. "Ma'am, the general's been looking for you. He'd like to introduce you around before the speeches." The word "Colonel" hit the circle like a bucket of cold water. The word after it, my name, the name that was going to be read off the orders in front of the entire group in about 16 hours, hit Vaughn somewhere deeper than that. I watched the math happen behind his eyes. "Colonel Rourke, Rourke, incoming, tomorrow, Commander." Across the room, a lane was opening in the crowd, the way a crowd opens for a general officer, and Major General Leland Foster was walking toward us with a smile on his face, coming to greet the woman his young captain had just sent to the coat check. Vaughn stood there at that involuntary half-attention, a full day early, understanding all at once that the person he had decided was support staff was going to take command of his group in the morning. The officers around him had gone completely silent. And I picked my glass back up off the bar because I was thirsty and because there was nothing else that needed doing. General Foster reached us before Vaughn found a way to finish either of his broken sentences. And I have to give the old man credit. He read the situation in about a second and a half, and he decided, without being told, exactly how to play it. He put out his hand, and he greeted me by name and rank, warmly, loudly enough for the whole knot of young officers to hear every syllable. And he told the circle that I was the finest officer he had served alongside in 30 years, and that they were lucky to be getting me. Then he tucked my hand into the crook of his arm, the way a proud man walks his daughter into a room, and he steered me away toward the head of the reception to introduce me to the people I'd be leading. I did not look back at Vaughn. I want you to understand that this was a decision, not an accident. There is a kind of person who would have turned around at that moment to watch the young captain squirm, to catch his eye and hold it and make sure he knew that I knew. I used to be closer to that kind of person than I am now. But I have learned that the look back is for you, not for them, and that it costs you something you can't get back. A leader who turns around to enjoy a subordinate's humiliation has told the whole room something true about herself, and it isn't the thing she wants them to know. So I looked forward. I let Foster walk me away. I let Vaughn stand in the wreckage of his own certainty without an audience of my satisfaction to perform for. Naomi found me 20 minutes later on the small balcony off the ballroom, where I had escaped for a few minutes of cold air. She was predictably ready to be furious on my behalf. She had heard the whole thing, or enough of it, and she wanted me to know that Vaughn was a captain, that I was going to be his commanding officer in the morning, and that if I wanted to, I could make the next 2 years of his life a very long hallway with no doors. She wasn't wrong about the power. That was the strange part. As of tomorrow morning, I would hold every lever a person could want to hold over a man like that. "I'm not angry, Naomi," I said, and I meant it. "You should be a little angry," she said. "For the rest of us, if not for you. He does that to the young ones, too. To the Blaines. He just does it quieter to them, so nobody with rank ever sees it." That landed. I'll admit that landed. I wasn't angry for myself, but I found I could get angry. A cold and useful kind of angry. For the Sergeant Blaines of the world, the ones who take it silently at the support tables. Because they don't have an eagle on their shoulder to make it stop. Being underestimated is not the wound, I told her, watching the baselights spread out below us in the dark. Believing them is the wound. I stopped believing them a long time ago, but the 22-year-old at that table hasn't stopped yet. That's who I'm angry for. I told her a little of the reason then, because she'd earned it, and because the night had cracked me open a fraction more than usual. I told her about a night in 2011 on a deployment whose details will stay where they belong, when the support element I led was the only thing standing between a team of operators and a very bad ending. A mission had gone sideways in the way missions do, fast and total, and for a stretch of hours in the dark, I was the calm voice and the clear picture and the decisions that got made when there was no time to make them well. 12 men walked out of that night who would not have otherwise. Nobody made a movie. But the device on my chest, the one Vaughn's eyes had found and recognized, came from that night and from a few others like it. It is not a paperwork award. The men who were there know exactly what it is. Vaughn, to his limited credit, had recognized it in half a second, which told me he wasn't stupid. Just young and lazy in the one way that matters most, lazy about people. I don't tell that story often. I told Naomi the shape of it and not the center, because the center belongs to the men who were on the other end of the radio that night, and it isn't mine to hand around at a party. But I'll tell you the part that matters for this. There was a moment, somewhere in the worst of it, when everyone who could have taken the weight off me was already carrying their own, and the decision sat with me alone, and it was the kind of decision where, if you are wrong, people die, and if you are slow, people die, and there is no version where you get to be sure. I made it. It was right, and the thing I remember most is not the relief afterward. It's that in the hours after, when the sun came up and the team was accounted for, not one person in the wider world would ever know a decision had been made at all. The raid got told and retold. The men at the tip got their due, and they deserved it. The plywood room, where the actual hinge of the night had turned, stayed dark and unmentioned. I made my peace with that a long time ago. You have to in the enabling world, or the silence eats you. But it is why I have exactly no patience for the idea that the quiet work is the small work. I have stood in the place where the quiet work was the only thing between a dozen families and the worst phone call of their lives. There's nothing small about it. There's only the fact that it doesn't photograph well. By the time Naomi and I went back inside, I had decided how I was going to handle Captain Vaughn, and it was not the long hallway with no doors. It would have been easy, and it would have felt good for about a week, and then it would have made me into a smaller commander than the group deserved. No, I was going to do something harder for both of us. I was going to make him watch, up close, exactly what the support he mocked actually is. I was going to hand him the thing I had spent my whole career carrying, and let its real weight teach him what my 2 seconds at the bar never could. I stood at the edge of the reception again near the end of the night, and I looked out over a community I had served for 28 years, from a coffee-ringed desk to the command I would take in the morning, and I decided, standing there, that tomorrow I would lead. Not punish, lead. There is a difference, and most people never learn it, and the ones who do usually learn it the way I did, by being on the wrong end of someone who never bothered. The change of command was the next morning, on the parade field, under a flat gray sky that never quite decided to rain. I have stood in a lot of formations in my life. I had never stood at the front of this one, at the center, waiting to be handed the colors of the group, and I would be lying if I told you it felt ordinary. It did not. There is a weight to a set of colors that has nothing to do with the fabric. I took them. The outgoing commander passed the staff to General Foster, and Foster passed it to me. And in that one motion, in front of every soul in the group, the picture of me that had been wrong in so many rooms for so many years was made right all at once. I held the colors. I was the commander. There was no misreading it now. My first address to the group was short. I have sat through enough long ones to know that nobody remembers the long ones. I told them that I did not measure this group by the raids it ran, but by the people it was willing to carry, and that the difference between a good unit and a great one was almost never talent, because we had talent to burn, but was almost always whether the people doing the loud work respected the people doing the quiet work that made the loud work possible. I told them I had spent my career being underestimated, and that I had come to see it as the single most useful thing that ever happened to me, because it taught me to look twice at everyone, and that I expected them to look twice too. Then I stopped talking, because I meant it and I didn't need to decorate it. Captain Vaughn was in that formation. I knew exactly where he was without looking for him. He stood there through the whole ceremony waiting, I think, for his name to be spoken, for the hammer to come down in front of everyone, for the public reckoning he'd earned and was braced for, It never came. I did not say his name. I did not so much as glance at his part of the field. For a man like Vaughn, I suspected, the not knowing would do more work than any call-out could. He came to find me afterward at the small reception behind the ceremony, and I watched him work up to it. He waited until the crowd around me thinned. Then he stepped in, came to a correct and rigid attention, and apologized. It was a real apology, as those things go. He didn't make excuses. He called it what it was, disrespectful and wrong, and he told me he was prepared to accept whatever consequence I saw fit. He was braced for the axe. You could see it in his shoulders. I let him stand there for a moment, not to torture him, just to let the moment be real. "You don't owe me an apology, Captain," I said finally. "I've been sent to the coat check by better men than you, and I'm still standing here holding the colors. You didn't hurt me. You can't." I paused, and I made sure he was looking at me. You owe the people you walk past every day a second look. The sergeant at the support table last night, the comm soldier who keeps you alive at 3 a.m. and whose name you've never learned. Start there. That's the debt. Not to me. He blinked. I don't think it was the conversation he'd rehearsed. He'd come ready to be punished, and being punished would have been easier, because being punished lets you feel like the price is paid and the slate is clean. I wasn't offering him a clean slate. I was offering him a mirror and a piece of work. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and I could tell he didn't fully understand yet what I was asking of him. He would. Not everyone in the group was ready to take the new commander at face value, and I didn't expect them to be. Command is earned twice, once on paper and once in the eyes of the people you lead, and the second one takes longer. Within my first week, a couple of senior officers tested me the way senior officers always test a new commander, especially one they'd quietly filed under the support colonel. One of them, a lieutenant colonel who ran one of the battalions, brought me a readiness shortfall he'd been papering over, clearly expecting that a commander with my background would either not catch it or not have the spine to force the fix. I caught it. I forced the fix. I did it without raising my voice and without giving him anywhere to hide, and I made sure he understood that I had come up through exactly the kind of unglamorous, detail-obsessed work that spots a shortfall like his from across a room. He recalibrated fast. They usually do, once they realize the quiet one is quiet by choice and not by weakness. The specific shortfall does not matter for the telling, but the way it happened does, because it's the whole difference between the commander they expected and the commander they got. He came into my office with a briefing built to slide past me, full of the right words and the confident cadence. A briefing designed for a leader who wanted to be reassured rather than informed. I have built 100 of those briefings in my life, from the other side of the desk, for exactly that kind of leader. I know every seam in them, so I let him get about 2/3 of the way through. And then I asked him one quiet question about the seam I'd already spotted, the number that didn't reconcile with the number 3 slides earlier, and I watched the briefing come apart in his hands. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply would not let him leave the room until we had a real plan to fix a real problem, and I made it plain, without ever saying it out loud, that the woman he'd filed under support had spent 20 years reading exactly the kind of briefing he'd just tried to walk past me. He left with more work than he'd come in with, and, I think, with a new and more accurate picture of who was now in charge. Word of that got around too, the way everything gets around in a tight unit, and it did something useful. It told the officers who'd been waiting to see whether the new colonel could be managed that the answer was no. Not because I was harsh, I wasn't, but because I could not be fooled by the performance of competence, having spent my whole career being the competence that other people performed over. There's no better lie detector in the world than a person who used to write the lies. They stopped bringing me the polished version after that. They started bringing me the real one. And a group where people bring their commander the real problem instead of the pretty briefing is a group that is about to get a great deal more dangerous to its actual enemies and a great deal less comfortable for anyone who'd been coasting. That was exactly the group I intended to build. And the story of the reception moved through the group the way stories move through any tight unit, faster than any email, in the version that gets told at the smoke pit and the motor pool in the chow line. How the new colonel got sent to the coat check by Vaughn the night before she took command. And, more importantly, how she'd handled it, which was to say, she hadn't handled it at all in the way everyone expected. She hadn't crushed him. She'd made him take a walk instead. That version told the formation more about who I was than my whole change of command speech had. You can tell a unit your values all day long. What they actually learn from is what you do the first time someone hands you a reason to be cruel, and you decline. The task I gave Captain Vaughn was simple to say and hard to do. I ordered him to spend the next week embedded with the enabling elements he had spent his career looking past. The intelligence shop, the medics, the communications soldiers, the logistics people who moved the beans and the bullets and the blood, not observing from a comfortable distance, working, carrying, learning names. I told him I wanted a full accounting at the end of the week, not of what they did, which I already knew, but of what he had gotten wrong about them, and I told him to be specific. He didn't like it. I didn't expect him to. A man like Vaughn measures his own worth in proximity to the tip of the spear, and I had just ordered him to go spend a week at the shaft. But he was, underneath the arrogance, a soldier, and a soldier follows an order even when the order is a lesson-wearing camouflage. I heard about the first day secondhand. He walked into the intelligence shop with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, ready to be bored, ready to be superior. And instead he ran straight into the reality that the picture he trusted with his life, downrange, the picture that told him where the enemy was and wasn't, was built by a handful of exhausted soldiers staring at screens for 16 hours at a stretch, catching the one detail that keeps a team from walking into the wrong compound. He had never once thought about where that picture came from. It had simply always been there, like water from a tap. And now he was standing in the room where the water was actually carried, bucket by people whose names he had never bothered to learn. The shop he spent the most time in was the one Sergeant Tessa Blaine worked in. That was not an accident. I had arranged it, quietly, because I wanted the circle to close, though I never told either of them so. Blaine, it turned out, was one of the sharpest young soldiers in the group. The kind who did 3 people's jobs without complaint and got noticed by no one because she never made noise about it. Vaughn spent 3 days in her shop before he understood what she actually did and how good she was at it, and how many times a capability like hers had reached out invisibly and saved a night for men exactly like him. I got the story of those 3 days in pieces, later, some from Vaughn's own written accounting and some from the non-commissioned officers who ran that shop and who watched a Green Beret captain arrive expecting to be bored and leave humbled. On the first day, I was told, he mostly stood with his arms crossed, doing the thing men like him do, occupying the room without joining it, waiting to be impressed and prepared not to be. Blaine, to her enormous credit, did not perform for him. She just worked, the way she always worked, and she answered his questions when he finally started asking them, plainly and without either deference or attitude, and slowly the arms came uncrossed. By the second day, he was carrying equipment and learning the systems and asking the kind of questions you only ask once you've realized you don't understand something you assumed you did. By the third day, he had started calling her by her name instead of Sergeant, which sounds like nothing and is, in fact, everything. Because the moment a man like Vaughn learns your name is the moment you stop being furniture to him and start being a person. What got him, I think, was not any single dramatic thing. It was the accumulation. It was watching a young woman half his size and a third his reputation sit at a screen for a shift so long it would have broken most people, chasing a thread most people wouldn't have seen was a thread, and finding at the end of it the one detail that mattered. It was realizing that this was not the exception, but the ordinary Tuesday, that the picture he had trusted with his life for his entire career had always been built exactly like this, by people exactly like her, at a cost he had never once bothered to imagine. He had spent years believing he lived at the sharp end of everything. He was learning, 3 days at a time, that the sharp end is only sharp because 100 invisible hands keep grinding it in the dark, and that he had mocked one of those hands at a cocktail party and called it small. I think it was the 4th day that it really got him, though. There was a tasking, the details of which don't matter and wouldn't survive being told, in which the enabling elements he'd been embedded with had to perform under real pressure, in real time, with real stakes on the other end. And Vaughn got to stand in the room and watch the support he had mocked at a cocktail party do the thing it exists to do. Watch a quiet, unshowy young sergeant and her colleagues find the one detail and make the one call that turned a bad situation good. No one in that room was at the tip of any spear. No one would get a medal or a movie. And they were, unmistakably, the difference between success and disaster. I watched him from the back of the room that day. I didn't gloat. I had no interest in gloating. I was measuring, the way I'd been measuring him since the reception, trying to decide whether Captain Garrett Vaughn was a man who would take this lesson in through his skin and be changed by it, or a man who would wait out the week and go right back to who he'd been the moment the requirement lifted. I genuinely did not know yet. I have been wrong about people in both directions, but I saw his face when the sergeant made the call that saved the night. And whatever else was true about him, in that moment the certainty was gone from it, and something quieter and more useful had started to grow in the empty space where it had been. He was beginning to understand that the tab on his shoulder had never been the whole story. It had only ever been the part of the story that got told out loud. At the end of the week, Captain Vaughn came to my office with his accounting, and he did not come to it the way he'd walked into the intelligence shop on the first day. He came in quiet. He had filled a lot of pages. He'd been specific the way I asked, and being specific had clearly cost him something, because you cannot make an honest list of everything you got wrong about people without also making a list of what that says about you. He did not ask for forgiveness. I noticed that, and I respected it. A lesser version of this conversation would have been him trying to get me to tell him he was a good man, really, to lift the weight back off him so he could feel clean. He didn't reach for that. Instead, he asked me a question I had not expected, and it was the question that told me he might actually make it. "Ma'am," he said, "how do you lead like that? How do you walk past being talked to the way I talk to you and not spend the whole next day making the person pay for it? Because I don't think I could have." I sat with that for a second because it deserved a real answer and not a poster on a wall. "You start," I said, "by getting very clear about where your worth actually comes from. When you think your worth comes from being the best operator in the room, then every person who disrespects you is a threat to the only thing you've got, and you have to crush them to survive. That's a small way to live, Captain, and it makes you cruel without you ever deciding to be. But when you know your worth comes from the work, from whether the people under you go home, from whether you saw the ones nobody else saw, then a man sending you to the coat check is just weather. It can't touch the thing that actually holds you up. You don't have to make him pay, because he never actually took anything." I looked at him. "You had a good week. Don't waste it by deciding you've learned the lesson. Deciding you've learned it is how you stop learning it." He nodded slowly. I didn't know if it would take. You never do. But it was a real question, and I had given it a real answer, and that is most of what leadership actually is on any given day. The unglamorous work of answering the real question, honestly, instead of performing the answer that makes you look good. I did not spend my energy that first month on Vaughn, though. I spent it on Sergeant Tessa Blaine, because you build a culture by what you reward, and I was determined that this group would start rewarding the right things. I pulled her file. It was exactly what I expected. A record of quiet excellence that nobody had bothered to advance. Evaluations full of praise and empty of opportunity. A soldier who had been allowed to be indispensable right where she was, because moving her would have inconvenienced the people she carried. It made me angry in the cold, useful way. I had seen this file 100 times. I had, in a manner of speaking, been this file. There was a school she should have been sent to 2 years earlier, a selection that would open real doors for her. The kind of door that had once been opened for me by a command sergeant major who bothered to look. She had never been put forward for it. When I called her into my office and told her I was putting her forward, she stood there in front of my desk and looked at me like I'd read her a sentence in a language she didn't speak. "Ma'am," she said, "why me?" I have thought about that question a lot since. Why me? It's the question every overlooked person eventually stops asking out loud. Because the world has taught them the answer is no reason, no one, move along. She asked it warily, half braced for the catch. "Because somebody did it for me once," I told her. "A long time ago, when I was a sergeant at a desk that everybody walked past, a man with more reason to ignore me than you can imagine looked at me twice and opened a door. I have spent the rest of my career trying to be worth that. And because," I said, "you were the only person in that ballroom still working while everyone else was laughing. I watched you. That's the soldier I want in that school, not the loudest one, the one who was still working." She didn't cry. She was too squared away for that, and I was glad, because I'm no good with it. She just came to attention and said, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice that had something underneath it, and left my office a different soldier than she'd walked in as. That's the whole job some days, that one thing. I made one more change that month, a small one, the kind of thing that outlasts any single confrontation because it gets baked into how a unit sees itself. I changed how the group told its own story. We are, all of us in that world, addicted to the story of the raid, the operators, the door, the dark. And it's a true story and a good one, and it deserves to be told. But it is not the only true story. And by telling it as if it were, we had built a culture that produced men like Vaughn as reliably as a factory. So I made it a standing practice that when we recognized a success, we named the whole chain. The intelligent soldier who found the detail. The medic who trained for the wound that thankfully never came. The comms specialist who held the link. Not as a courtesy, as the truth. Because a group that only ever celebrates the tip of the spear is quietly teaching every young soldier in it that the shaft doesn't matter, and then acting surprised when its captains send colonels to the coat check. The first time the new practice really landed was a few weeks in, when a team came back from a difficult tasking and the after-action was briefed to the whole formation. And Captain Vaughn, whose team it was, stood up in front of everyone, and before he said a word about what his men had done in the dark, he named the sergeant in the intelligence shop who had found the thing that made it possible. He named her out loud in front of the group, and he said, plainly, that his team had walked out of that night because of a call she made at a screen while they slept. It was the exact opposite of a cocktail party by the coat check. And I sat in the back and I let myself believe, a little, that the lesson had taken. Not everything wrapped up in a neat bow, and I wouldn't trust it if it had. Culture doesn't turn on a single ceremony or a single embedded week. There were still senior officers who thought I was soft. There were still young captains coming up through the pipeline with the same blind spot Vaughn had arrived with. And there always would be, because the thing that produces that blind spot is baked into how we talk about ourselves. The work of leading a group like that is not a battle you win. It's a garden you tend, and it grows back wild the second you stop paying attention. But something had shifted, and I could feel it the way you feel weather change before the sky does. A few weeks into command, on an ordinary evening, I stayed late in my office after everyone had gone home. It was quiet in the way a headquarters only gets after dark, when the phones stop and the hallways empty and the building settles onto its foundation. The walls of that office held the group's history, photographs and guidons, and the faces of men and women who had built the thing I was now responsible for. I stood in front of them for a while. I thought about Duke Ellison. I thought about what he would have made of all of it. The reception, the coat check, the young captain, the sergeant I'd put forward for the school. Duke had a line for everything, and I could hear the one he'd have used for this, in that gravel voice that had lived in my head for a quarter of a century. The measure of a leader, he used to say, is who salutes when you leave the room, not who salutes when you walk in. Anyone can command the salute on the way in. Rank does that for you, the colors do that for you. The formation stands and renders honors because the regulations say it must. That kind of respect is free, and because it's free, it's worth almost nothing. The respect that costs something, the respect that means anything, is the kind that's still there when you turn to go, when there's no requirement left, when the people behind you could think whatever they liked and you'd never know. That was the respect I wanted. Not the room coming to attention when I entered. The room meaning it when I left. I didn't have it yet. You don't get it in a month. But I could feel, standing in that quiet office in front of those old faces, that I was building toward it. One honest conversation and one open door at a time. And I thought Duke would have looked at the state of things, the reception behind me and the long work ahead of me, and he'd have grunted once, which from Duke was a standing ovation, and told me to get back to it. Captain Vaughn faced a real test not long after, the kind that tells you whether a change is skin deep or bone deep. One of his own team leaders, a strong soldier, made exactly the kind of dismissive comment about an enabler that Vaughn himself would have made a few months earlier, and made it in front of the team, and it landed the way those things land, with a little laugh from the men who were watching to see how the leader would react. And Vaughn had a choice. He could let it go, laugh along, be one of the guys, keep the easy loyalty of his team, or he could do the harder thing, the thing that would cost him a little of that easy warmth, and correct it in front of everyone, and plant the same flag I had planted with him. He corrected it. I heard about it later, from 3 different directions, which is how you know a thing is real in a unit. He'd stopped the laugh, named the enabler the soldier had dismissed, told his team plainly that the man who talked that way about the people who kept them alive was a man he didn't want in his formation, and moved on without making a speech of it. He'd chosen the harder, humbler path when no one with rank was watching him do it. When it would have been easier and warmer to be the son again. That was the moment I stopped worrying about Garrett Vaughn. And Sergeant Blaine, my quiet sergeant from the support table, went to her school. She did not just pass it. She finished at the very top of it, the kind of finish that gets a person's name spoken in rooms they've never been in. And when the results came back to the group, I read them alone in my office, and I let myself feel it all the way down. The particular warmth of watching a door you pried open led exactly where you knew it would. She would have opportunities now that the old culture would have quietly kept from her forever. She'd earned them 12 times over. All anyone had ever had to do was look twice. And for 2 years, no one had. And then someone did, and the whole trajectory of a life bent toward the light. There was a new challenge coming for the group as I write this, the way there always is, a hard tasking on the horizon that would test everything I'd been building. I found, sitting with it, that I wasn't afraid of it. For most of my career, I had led a little bit in disguise, being the steady, competent one while letting the room believe whatever it needed to believe about me. For the first time, I was leading fully as myself, no disguise, the woman who came up from the coffee-ringed desk and the plywood room and the night in 2011 that nobody made a movie about. And I found that I had never been more ready for anything. I turned off the office light on my way out that evening. In the last of it, before the room went dark, the small crest on my uniform caught the light for a second. The same pin a young captain's eyes had found across a crowded reception. The one that had meant nothing to him until all at once, it meant everything. I looked at it for a moment in the dim, and then I went home, and I did not yet know exactly what I was going to build with the years I had left in that command, and for once the not knowing felt like an open door instead of a locked one. Months later, there was another community event in another ballroom that could have been the same one, the kind of gathering that had been quietly sorting me my whole career. I walked in early, out of habit, and took a glass of water I didn't intend to finish, and stood at the edge to read the room the way I always do. And the room read me correctly. That was the difference. People came to me, greeted me by name and rank, made space, the way a community makes space for someone it has decided to see. No one handed me an empty glass. No one pointed me toward the coat check. The picture had been corrected, not just on the orders in the parade field, but in the slow, real way, in the eyes of the people in the room. The strange thing, the thing I would not have predicted at 20 or 30, was that I noticed I no longer needed them to. That was the actual payoff, not the recognition, the not needing. For a long time, being seen correctly had been a thing I told myself I didn't want and secretly did. And somewhere in the work of that first command, in the coat check night and the open doors and the quiet office after dark, I had finally arrived at the place Duke had been pointing me toward for 25 years, where the room's opinion of me had come all the way loose from my knowledge of myself. They could have gotten it wrong again that night, sent me to the coat check all over again, and it would have slid right off. I knew who I was. I had known for a while. The room catching up was nice. It was no longer necessary. I saw Vaughn across that ballroom, and he was a different man than the one who'd smirked at me all those months before. I watched him, without his knowing it, do a small and completely unwitnessed right thing. There was a young soldier working the edge of the event, a support soldier, squared away and invisible, being talked over by an officer with a drink in his hand, exactly the way Blaine had been the night this all started. And Vaughn stepped in, quietly. No audience, no performance, nothing in it for him. He set a small boundary for the young soldier and moved on, the way I had done for Blaine, the way Duke had done for me, and he never once looked around to see if anyone had noticed. Nobody had. That was the point. That was the whole thing. A man does the right thing when no one is watching, or he doesn't, and everything else is just talk. And Blaine, my sergeant, was there too, thriving, wearing her success lightly, the way the best of them do. I watched her, later in the evening, catch a younger soldier being overlooked and step in, pass the thing forward without being asked, without being told, because someone had done it for her and now it was simply who she was. The cycle I'd inherited from Duke, the one he'd inherited from someone whose name I never learned, went one more turn, out past me, into hands that would carry it after I was gone. That is the only kind of immortality our line of work offers, and it is more than enough. I stood there for a while and just watched the two of them, Vaughn and Blaine, from opposite corners of a room that had no idea what it was looking at. A captain who had learned to see, and a sergeant who had always been worth seeing, and the small invisible thread that now ran between them and out into the group and past all of us. Neither of them knew I was watching. That was the best part. There was a time in my life when I would have needed one of them to catch my eye across that room, to give me some small acknowledgement that I had been the hinge the whole thing turned on. I felt none of that now. It was enough to know it was true. It was enough that the young soldier at the edge of the event got a boundary set for her by a man who a year ago would have been the one talking over her. The good you do quietly does not need a receipt. If you find yourself needing the receipt, you have not yet learned the lesson all the way down. And I had finally, after 28 years, learned it all the way down. Duke would have grunted. I could almost hear him. Get back to it, Rourke. So I did. I stepped outside near the end of the night into an ordinary evening, cool and unremarkable, and I stood there by myself for a minute in the quiet. I thought about the whole arc of it. The recruiting sergeant in 1998 who saw an admin clerk, the coat check, the pin, the 28 years between the two. I thought about how much of my life had been spent being handed the small version of myself by people who couldn't be bothered to look, and how the thing that had felt like a curse at 18 had turned out to be the exact tool that made me the commander I became. You cannot learn to see the overlooked until you have been the overlooked. It's the one lesson you can't be taught. You have to live it. If someone has ever looked at everything you carry and called it small, I want you to hear me. Let them. Keep your hands steady. Do the quiet work no one claps for, and do it well. And do it even when the room is laughing at somebody like you at the support table. The truth about who you are does not need the room to laugh with you, and it does not need the salute on the way in. It just needs you to keep showing up, again and again, as exactly who you are, until the day the room finally catches up, and the even better day after that, when you realize you don't need it to. If you've ever been the person at the support table, doing the quiet work while the room laughed at somebody like you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Did you ever get the moment when someone finally looked twice? Have you ever been the one who got to open a door for a person the world kept walking past? And if you'd been in that ballroom, would you have sent the captain to the coat check right back or walked away the way I did? Tell me, I read every single one. If this story hit home for you, hit subscribe and stay a while.